All right, so get ready because today we're diving into something pretty unexpected. We're going to be talking about men, cross-dressing, and you're not going to believe the surprising allure of satin panties.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that really makes you think, huh.
You guys sent this in, so clearly you're as intrigued by this connection as I am.
Well, and what I find fascinating here, and this goes way beyond just clothing, is how something so seemingly simple, right, can become this like unexpected gateway to self-discovery.
Exactly. And we're lucky enough to be diving into a bunch of interviews with men who describe this exact experience. It all seems to start with that initial wow moment when it comes to satin. Okay, Karaman, you felt satin, right? That almost like illicit smoothness,
Yeah.
it's definitely a far cry from your usual cotton or flannel you find in a guy's dresser drawer.
Oh, absolutely. And think about it like men's clothing, it often prioritizes practicality, durability, almost like it has to be ready for a hard day's work on the ranch, even if the most strenuous thing you do all day is hit reply all on a few emails.
That's hilarious and so true.
But satin, though, satin whispers luxury, indulgence, maybe even a hint of vulnerability, qualities that men aren't exactly encouraged to embrace growing up.
Oh, no kidding. And you know what's fascinating? Several guys in these interviews actually use the word forbidden to describe their first experience with satin panties. Like they'd stumbled into this secret society where different rules apply.
Oh, 100%. And that forbidden aspect, that's key here, because it throws light on how restrictive traditional masculinity can be, even if we don't always consciously realize it. So, choosing satin, a fabric so intertwined with femininity, it becomes a subtle act of rebellion. This isn't just about fabric, it's semiotics. Even seemingly insignificant choices, they can be powerful statements.
Like a silent revolution in the underwear drawer, so to speak.
Exactly.
And speaking of drawers, a lot of these guys' first encounters with satin panties happen, during adolescence. That classic story of a teenage boy, his mom's laundry basket, and maybe a little too much curiosity.
Oh yeah, the lingerie drawer discovery. It's practically a recurring motif in these narratives.
It really is.
But what's interesting is how many men, and this is where that sensory experience becomes so crucial, they describe this discovery as initially not being driven by anything sexual.
Exactly. We've got one interview here with a guy named Interviewee 1, and he was 16, maybe 17, found a pair of his mom's satin panties in the laundry, and he emphasizes, like that first touch, it was all about the contrast. Imagine being used to, kind of rough cotton your whole life, and then suddenly there's this incredibly smooth, almost sensual material.
Right, and that's where we kind of bump into a little bit of neuroscience. You see, touch is powerful. Studies have shown that, like, tactile stimulation, especially those that evoke feelings of comfort or pleasure, they can actually impact our emotional well-being. So it's possible that for men who haven't explored, a wide range of fabrics, that first encounter with satin, it's like tapping into a sensory experience that's been somewhat neglected.
It's like finding a hidden oasis in the desert of khakis and cargo shorts.
Yes, 100%.
But for many of these guys, it becomes about more than just the initial thrill of something new, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It does become about pushing those boundaries even further. We see guys experimenting with other types of lingerie, maybe even venturing into full outfits. It's like that satin was just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah.
And now they're diving into a whole ocean of self-expression.
And get this, it's not always a straight line from point A to point B. One guy we read about, Interviewee 2, he was in his 20s, bought himself a pair of satin panties, just to see what the fuss was all about,
Right, right. And this is where it gets really interesting because he talks about how that act of buying the panties for himself, was incredibly empowering. It wasn't about anyone else. It was about him taking control, exploring a side of himself that maybe he'd always sensed but never felt permission to, acknowledge.
It's like he cracked open a door he didn't even know was there, and suddenly this whole new world of possibility opens up.
Yes, exactly.
In his case, it went from the satin panties to lingerie, then skirts, dresses. He even started experimenting with wigs.
Wow. Which brings us back to that idea of masculinity being this incredibly limiting box. And here's the thing about boxes, they can get pretty stuffy if you stay in them too long.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing with these guys is that cross-dressing, starting with something as simple as a pair of satin panties, it can be a way to bust out of that box and discover the full spectrum of who they are.
Totally. And it's crucial to remember as we're deep diving into this, that this isn't always about wanting to be a woman. Several of the men in these interviews identify as straight, cisgender, They're not looking to change who they are fundamentally.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's such a good point to bring up because it highlights something really important, which is that gender expression and sexual orientation, they don't always, they're not always perfectly aligned. And that's more than okay. It's about recognizing the beautiful complexity of human identity.
100%. Now, we've talked about the allure of the forbidden, the thrill of pushing boundaries. But there's also this recurring theme of comfort that keeps popping up. So many of these guys describe feeling this sense of ease, of relaxation in satin panties that they just don't get from, like, conventional men's underwear.
Right, and that's where things get really fascinating on a psychological level.
Yeah.
This ties into a concept called sensory deprivation, where a lack of, diverse sensory input can actually lead to feelings of unease or discomfort. Think about it, men's underwear, for the most part, is pretty basic.
Yeah?
It's cotton, it's functional, it doesn't exactly scream sensory delight, does it?
Not really. You got your boxers, your breeks,
Yeah.
not a whole lot of variation on offer.
Precisely. Now, introduce satin into the equation. It's soft, it flows, it drapes differently against the skin. It's a completely different sensory experience.
Yeah.
And for some men, that can be incredibly comforting, even liberating.
It's like their nervous system is finally getting a chance to relax and enjoy the ride instead of being stuck in the same old routine. But here's the million-dollar question. Why satin, specifically? Why not silk or lace or any other number of fabrics you typically associate with women's clothing?
Right. There's something about this particular fabric that seems to be hitting a sweet spot. Part of it might be that satin occupies this interesting middle ground. You know what I mean? It's got that luxurious feel, but it's also readily available, often more affordable than like silk or lace. You don't have to go to a specialty store. You can find satin lingerie in most department stores. It's familiar, yet it still carries that air of, the other.
Yeah, it's like the gateway drug of lingerie fabrics.
Yeah.
Accessible, but with the potential to lead to a whole new world of exploration.
100%. And you know what else is interesting about satin? It can be both delicate and durable.
Oh, interesting.
It can be incredibly soft against the skin, but it also holds up well to washing and wearing. That might seem like a small detail, but on a subconscious level, it could contribute to that feeling of comfort and ease that these men describe.
It's like the satin is whispering, hey, I get it. You want to feel pampered, but you also need something that can handle your day-to-day life. I'm here for you.
Exactly. But let's not forget the elephant in the room here. We've been talking a lot about the sensory experience, but there's also an undeniable psychological component at play here.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I think things get really interesting because it's not just about the feel of the fabric anymore. It's about how that fabric makes you feel about yourself, about your relationship to masculinity, femininity, and everything in between.
Precisely. Remember what we said earlier about those restrictive boxes of masculinity? Choosing to wear satin, a fabric so often associated with femininity and sensuality, it can create a kind of cognitive dissonance in men who've been, taught to suppress those aspects of themselves.
So like on the one hand, you've got this incredibly pleasurable, like sensory experience, this feeling of softness and comfort that maybe they haven't had access to before. But then on the other hand, there's this like ingrained belief that real men don't wear satin, that it's somehow taboo or off limits.
Yeah, and that clash, that internal struggle, it can actually be a catalyst for growth. It forces you to confront those like ingrained beliefs, to question why something as simple as a fabric choice can feel so revolutionary.
Yeah, it's like that satin becomes this unexpected mirror, right? Reflecting back these hidden parts of themselves that they didn't even know were there. Now, we've heard from men who started with satin and then went on to explore other forms of cross-dressing. But what about the guys for whom it's really more about the feel of the fabric itself?
Right. And that's such an important point because it speaks to the beautiful diversity of human experience, even within this specific niche, right? For some, it's about the sensory pleasure, the feeling of satin against their skin. And that's perfectly valid in its own right.
100%, yeah. It's about finding what feels authentic and true to you without judgment.
Absolutely.
But then we have a story like interviewee 3's. He describes how wearing satin panties actually helped him understand his own gender fluidity.
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff, right? To have this realization about yourself sparked by something as simple as a fabric.
It's incredible, isn't it? His story really highlights how clothing can be so much more than just a way to cover our bodies. It can be a tool for self-discovery, a way to unlock and express those hidden parts of ourselves.
So tell me about his experience. What was it about satin that led to this realization for him?
Well, he started out, as many do, just enjoying the feel of the fabric, but then he started paying attention to how it made him feel, like internally.
Okay.
Not just the physical sensation, but the emotional, even psychological shift that came with wearing satin.
And what did he discover through that process?
He realized that his sense of gender wasn't fixed, not the rigid binary that he'd always assumed it to be.
Wow.
Some days he'd feel that sense of comfort, of rightness, wearing, satin panties. Other days he'd be perfectly content, even joyful, in like jeans and a t-shirt. It wasn't about wanting to be a woman, but about recognizing that fluidity within
But
himself.
it's incredibly profound. Like that satin was the key that unlocked a door he didn't even know existed.
Right. And think about the courage that takes to not only acknowledge those feelings, but to embrace them, to allow yourself to exist outside those like predefined boxes of, what it means to be a man.
It really makes you question all those assumptions we make about clothing and gender. We see satin panties and we instantly think feminine, but the reality is so much more nuanced, so much more individual.
100%. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so compelling, It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question those ingrained beliefs, and to appreciate the deeply personal journeys that can be sparked by something as seemingly insignificant as fabric.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listener, the one who sent in this fascinating topic?
That's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway here is the power of self-discovery and the importance of like questioning those societal norms that try to put us in these neat little boxes. The men that we've heard from today, they each found their own unique paths to exploring their identities, and for many of them, satin panties of all things were the catalyst.
Yeah, it's like it opened a door to a whole new world of self-expression, a world where they could explore these different facets of themselves without judgment or limitations. So to our listener, I'll leave you with this. What seemingly insignificant things in your asterisk own life might hold these deeper meanings? What sparks your curiosity, even if you can't quite explain why?
It's in those moments of curiosity, of questioning, that we often find the most like unexpected and rewarding paths to self-discovery.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those possibilities. Thanks for joining us for another fascinating deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another exploration into the unexpected.